Welcome, I'm Tamara, and this is a tutorial for Ladderback Jacquard, which is a colorwork technique for catching long floats. This is in support of my tarot card sweater pattern, which I have on right now. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to read a Ladderback Jacquard chart, or how to create your own if you don't have a chart that's set up for it, how to start a Ladderback Jacquard ladder, which is like the column of knits on the wrong side, how to work a ladder every time you pass it on both the right side and the wrong side, how to switch colors, how to end a ladder when you don't need it anymore, and those are all the techniques. So I'll put chapters, so if you want to skip ahead to any particular section that's most relevant for you, you're welcome to do that. So the reason to use Ladderback Jacquard is when you're working a stranded knitting project and you have really long floats, and you really want to make sure that they don't show through on the other side of the work. A float in color work is when you have the color you're not using held across the back of the work, like a strand of yarn across the back, in between two stitches of the same color. And the reason that you don't want long floats is a couple reasons. One is it can just be really hard to gauge exactly the right length of yarn to use for that. If you do not enough length, then your color work is going to end up being lumpy and bunched because the float across is going to be too tight and it's going to kind of bow out your color work as you go. And then if you make it too loose, it can kind of loosen up the stitches along the edges, so it just looks kind of messier. The other reason is it's nice to not have long floats because they can get caught on your fingers when you're putting your sweater on, etc. So it just kind of stabilizes your knitting more. There are other ways of catching floats. I have a tutorial that shows you how to catch floats a different way, but I think especially for really long, wide expanses of a single color, like where you have all navy here or all white across the star, the other techniques for catching your floats can tend to show through your work a little bit more. So Ladderback Jacquard is just a surprisingly intuitive, once you get in the flow of it, way of basically knitting together your floats on the wrong side of your work. So you're basically creating almost like a mesh-like fabric on the wrong side of your work. So that stabilizes all of the floats into their own kind of knit together fabric. And it's also just easier to gauge. The distance is a lot shorter when you don't have to span across this entire length. You can put a column in the middle, for instance, and then just span a little float on either side. Here's a tarot card tote bag that I made with, it has the moon on one side and the sun on the other. So I use Ladderback Jacquard on both of these. So you can see here, like there's just black in the center and we have these big wide expanses of white. So I'll show you on the inside. This is the Ladderback Jacquard mesh that I was talking about. So here you have the moon in the center. I have these columns of black stitches that are the Ladderback Jacquard ladders. So those are distanced. I have two, I have three on this side, but that are just like in between the spaces where otherwise this would just be one very, very long float. Let's go into the tutorial and I'll show you all of the techniques. Let's first look quickly at how to read a Ladderback Jacquard chart. So here is a chart that I printed out for just like a quick swatch that I want to do with a star. So you can see we have both colors used in every single row. There's 24 stitches in between the two white stitches on this first row here. So that's way too long of a float. So these columns that have a dot in them indicate a Ladderback Jacquard column. So that means that when I get to that stitch, on the very next stitch, in between the one with the dot and the next one, I want to insert a Ladderback Jacquard column. If you're working off a chart that doesn't have the Ladderback columns written out, or if you just want to make it like easier for you to remember where the column or ladder should actually go, is you can just draw kind of like a thicker line where you want to put them. And in general, I would just space out, 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 stitches at most in between each of the ladders. Like you don't want floats longer than that. So this can be helpful. So you can do this if you're working off a Ladderback Jacquard chart anyway, just to make it clearer for yourself, or you can just draw these lines in for anything that you've printed out. And that just reminds you where to put them. So you can see there's like actually 4 stitches in between each of these ladders. So the ladder will go in between stitch 6 and 7, in between stitch 10 and 11, in between 14 and 15, 18 and 19, 22 and 23. So that's how to read this type of chart, and a way that you can create your own if you are working off of one that doesn't have the columns shown for you. So now let's get into the actual techniques. So I cast on a little swatch that's 27 stitches wide to match my chart. I'm using Cascade Sport 220, which is the yarn that I used for my sweater. And I've just knit a couple rows to like get myself started. So now let's begin the color chart. So on the right sides, I'm reading the color chart from right to left. So I'm gonna work 1 stitch in the dark color before I do 1 stitch in the light color. So 1 stitch in the dark, 1 stitch in the white. And now I have 4 dark stitches before I need to add my first column. So I'm just gonna knit those now. And now I'm gonna add my first Ladderback Jacquard column or ladder. I just call them columns because I don't know, it's like easier for me to view it that way. You can also call it a ladder. So every time I work a Ladderback Jacquard column, I need to take the working yarn, so whatever yarn I'm going to use for the next stitch in the chart, and I need to bring it to the front of the work. And that's because I'm going to work this stitch behind it, and then this yarn will be carried in front of it, which basically hides it when you're viewing it from the right side. So bring your next stitch, whatever color you're using for your next stitch, bring it forward in front of your work. So now I need to create a new stitch in between these 2 stitches, and that new stitch is going to be what's used for my Ladderback Jacquard column. So to do that, I'm going to be doing basically like a make one right increase. So I'm going to put the bar in between these 2 stitches up on my left needle so that it's slanting to the right. This is basically like a make one right increase. You could also do it to the left. It doesn't really make a difference. And then I'm going to take my white yarn, the one that I need to do the column for here, and I'm going to knit into the front leg of that stitch and give it a little tug. It's good to have like a very loose float, especially on this first setup. And so now you can see I've created this new white stitch in between the 2 black stitches. So this stitch doesn't exist on my color chart. It's only represented by this line or the dot. And that's because it's not going to show up in the finished product. And I still have this blue yarn to the front. When I go to work the next stitch, I'll move it to the back. And then you can see it's basically hiding like the base of this stitch. So as you work, it will always be covering that distance in between, so this won't be visible on the front side. This is a little bit similar to a technique like double knitting, if you've ever done that. So next I have 4 stitches before my next column, so I'm going to knit these 4 stitches in my main color yarn. And now I'm going to do the same thing again to make another column where it's marked in my chart. So bring the working yarn forward, take the bar up onto your left needle, and then knit into it with the other color yarn. And then bring the working yarn back. Again, I like to give a little tug just to loosen up that float even more. And it's a good idea to kind of test as you go, like stretch out your work and make sure that you've really got enough space for each of these floats. So I finished knitting all of my Ladderback Jacquard columns. I've gotten to the last 2 stitches on my needles, and I actually have a white stitch as my second to last one. So make sure that when you are actually encountering a stitch that's meant to be in the other color, don't bring the main color background yarn to the front. You want to leave that behind. So if I were knitting a Ladderback Jacquard stitch, I'd bring this to the front before working this, but I'm not, so I'm leaving it to the back. And then I'm just knitting this stitch like normal. When I look at what I have so far, this is a normal stitch. This is a ladderback column, ladderback column, ladderback column, ladderback column, ladderback column. This is a normal stitch. That's how you set up the very first column. And I'm gonna turn my work now and show you a technique I like for making it easier to tell apart the ladderback stitches versus the regular stitches in the contrast color. It can be a little bit hard to tell the difference between the 2 of them, and you don't want to accidentally knit one of these stitches like a normal stitch when you work past it, because then you're going to be increasing one and it's going to be visible on the right side of your work and it's going to mess up your color work. So let's turn to our work and I'll show you how I like to knit those on the wrong side. By the way, since I'm working color work flat, I read from right to left on the right side rows and from left to right on the wrong side rows. That's just how you're meant to read a chart when you're working color work flat. So I'm purling on the wrong side, and now I have my first white color stitch. Again, this does show up on my color chart, so I'm just going to purl it like normal. And then I'm going to purl these 3 stitches, and that brings me to my first Ladderback Jacquard column. So a way to tell apart the Ladderback Jacquard stitch versus the stitch that's actually supposed to show up in your color chart is to knit them on the wrong side and purl them on the right side. So that means that anytime I'm on a wrong side row and I encounter a knit stitch instead of a purl stitch, that means it must be a Ladderback Jacquard column that I need to be sure to move the working yarn to the front before I knit it. And then vice versa, when I'm on the right side, anytime I see a purl stitch, that's telling me, oh, that must be a Ladderback Jacquard column, and I need to make sure that I work it like a ladderback stitch. Bring the main color yarn between the two needles to the right side of the work. You're gonna wanna bring the contrast color yarn between the two needles to the right side of the work as well before you knit it. If you try to knit it without moving it between the two needles, it'll create like a yarn over where it wraps around the needle, so you don't want that. So bring them both between the needles to the right side and then knit the next stitch with your jacquard stitch color. When you're done, bring both of the yarns back between the needles to the wrong side of the work that's closest to you. So you just worked one knit stitch on the Ladderback Jacquard column. And you can see from the right side of the work, that will show up as a purl. So that kind of tells apart the purl stitch, you know, is a Ladderback Jacquard column, whereas when I see that color in a knit stitch, I know that it's actually meant to be there. It's a part of the color chart. So I'll show you that again as we work across this first row. So normally when I'm just working the color chart stitches, I have both of my yarns are in front of the work and I'm just purling these stitches. And now I hit a Ladderback Jacquard stitch. So I need to bring first the main yarn to the back, then the Ladderback Jacquard column yarn to the back and knit this stitch. And now I need to bring this one to the front again and this one to the front again and continue on. Okay, and here I've reached the other side. So I actually do have a white stitch that needs to be worked as a purl and it's meant to be in the color chart. So I'm not going to bring my navy yarn to in between. I'm leaving it in front where it is like you normally purl. I'm leaving it there. And I'm not going to bring this one to the back either. I'm leaving them both in front and I'm purling. And in this case, the navy yarn will be spanning that gap in the back, which is just a normal float. And then I'll purl the final stitch. So I'm going to turn back and you can see that these white stitches, even though I've now done them for a couple of rows, they're hidden behind the bars in between the navy stitches. And that's because I'm bringing that yarn to the right side of the work before I knit this or purl this stitch. Whereas here, the navy yarn is spanning across the back of the work. So it's not hiding this stitch, so it's visible from the right side, which we want because it's actually there in our color chart. I'll show you how to work it on the right side. So I'm now on row 3 of my pattern. So I'm gonna work these columns and I'll show you what to do where this is switching colors. Here's my first white stitch. This does show up in the color chart. So I'm leaving both the yarns in back and I'm just knitting this stitch like normal. Okay, so I've just reached my first Ladderback Jacquard column. So the fact that it's shaped like a bump or a purl tells me that this is not a regular stitch. I shouldn't work it like a regular stitch and instead I need to purl it. So to work these Ladderback Jacquard stitches on the right side, again, I'm bringing this blue yarn in between the needles to the front because I want it out of the way for this stitch. It's not going to be used for this stitch. And I'm taking my white yarn. I also need to bring it in between the needles to the front to get it ready to purl because I'm going to purl these on the right side. And now I'm going to insert to purl, wrap the yarn, pull it through, and continue. So I just knit up to this point, and now I want to bring both yarns in between the needles and then use the white yarn to purl this stitch and then bring both yarns back. So stitch number 14 in the last row was navy, but in this next row is white. So now I'm going to change the color of the stitch and the color of the column because I could choose to like end the column here, but it looks like it's going to be useful for me to just keep it all the way up because it will be nice to like span this gap here when I have a long stretch of white stitches. I said that that stitch is changing from navy to white, so I'm gonna knit the stitch in white as a normal stitch, so I'm not bringing any yarns to the front, I'm just keeping them in back like normal. And now I'm deciding, okay, I'm gonna make this column navy. So I need to bring both of the yarns to the front, and I'm going to purl it in the navy yarn because I want that column to now be navy. And then I bring both the yarns to the back. The next stitch is also navy. That's totally fine. This working yarn is what's going to hide that stitch behind the work. So it's fine if you have a column and then the next stitch is the same color as the column. That's totally fine. So I'm going to continue working in navy. I would basically work a slip, slip, knit if I wanted to end this column. So I would slip the first stitch knitwise, slip the next stitch also knitwise, and then knit them together through the back loop. And that basically puts the wrong color is like layered behind the right color. And when you actually have the fabric like blocked and laying nicely, that makes it almost invisible. When I get to the stitch before the column, I can just purl those two together. And you'll see the way that that orients it. When it's all together, you won't be able to see it. So you'll always want to end the Ladderback Jacquard column with the stitch that is before it on the needles. So it doesn't matter if you're on the right or the wrong side, you'll always work to one stitch before the column before you decide to end it. I'll show you what would happen if you worked it the other way around, where you knit up until the column you wanted to end. If you worked those two together with a purl two together, then that column would be visible. The color would be visible on the right side. So that would mess up your color work chart. Sometimes you need to like tug around a little bit if the yarn is sticky and it's like stuck itself in a way that makes it really visible on the right side. You can just kind of pull those stitches apart a little bit. And you can see where I ended it here. I can just kind of fluff up the navy in front of it, and it shouldn't be particularly visible. So if you want to start a Ladderback Jacquard column on the wrong side, I already showed you how to start it on the right side, and you can do that at any point. You don't have to do it like before you begin color work. You can do it at any point if you decide this gap is too long, this float is too long, I want to put a Ladderback Jacquard column in the middle of it. You can do that on any row. So you're going to bring the working yarn to the front, and then you're going to lift that bar up onto the needles, and then you're going to purl into it with the wrong color or the opposite color, and then bring both the yarns back to the center. One final thing I wanted to add is that you can work Ladderback Jacquard in the round too. You don't have to only work it flat. So my tote bag, we knit in the round, and the instructions are the same. You just don't have to worry about any of the wrong side things that I showed you. You would just continue carrying both yarns across, working in the round, and you purl the Ladderback Jacquard columns on every row and knit the rest of the stitches. So that's my tutorial for Ladderback Jacquard and kind of my pitch on why I think it's a great technique to use. I have to say a lot of my test knitters for this pattern had never used Ladderback Jacquard before, and all of the feedback that I got at the end of the test knit was that they were so glad that they learned this technique and they want to use it in the future for color work, and that once you actually get into the groove of it, it is a lot more intuitive than you might otherwise think it is. And if you have any other questions about this technique, feel free to drop a comment below and let me know anything that you're confused about or anything else that you would want to see, like and or follow if you're interested in more tutorials or seeing more kind of behind the scenes designing things, etc. So thank you so much for watching and have fun knitting.